Our next lecturer is visiting us from Sweden. She an assistant professor at the Institution of Social Work at Linnaeus University. She is a social worker and conflict management specialist who has a great interest in restorative justice, victimology, violence prevention, and nonviolence communication, both in daily life and in research. Please welcome Professor Esti Friedman.
Thank you. I'm actually quite humbled being here today for me. It's coming back home in a way to the place where the faculty where I grew up. So I'm very humble and excited. And we're talking here about restorative justice, forgiveness, and prisons. And I would like to give you a bit of an idea to those of you who are not well familiar with the concept of restorative justice, or those who have questions about restorative justice. I will give you a bit of information about these processes, and then I will give you more ways in which restorative justice is applied in different places in the world. And especially I will put my emphasis, of course, on how it's embedded in prison and the problems and the questions which could arise by putting two systems which are so much different together. And the question is, are they really so much different? When I look back at the early days of when I started my journey with restorative justice, only few people here in this crowd look at it as something worthwhile to study, a worthwhile way of dealing with crime. I won't tell you how much because then I will reveal my age in a moment. At the time, it was mostly theory or ideology, based on mostly aspirations of how a criminal justice should look like. But in these last 20 years, there has been a great change, both in evidence-based, which we now have, and there is much more clarity of what can we expect from restorative justice and what can we not expect from restorative justice. Peter, before he mentioned a person named Albert Iglash. Every basic literature on restorative justice, his name is mentioned as the person who named the term restorative justice. However, Albert Iglash worked in no other than Riker Island's penitentiary prisons for us laymen. He called it creative restitution, which was the forefather of restorative justice, and he laid the basic value of which we know today. I think it would be very interesting to those of you who are interested in restorative justice to go and read about his work, because he published. He didn't publish a lot, but he published. But he is the one that almost set the values of what we know today as restorative justice. And Iglash, he actually did what we call today exploratory research. And he wanted his clients to be accountable for their behavior by understanding their part in the harm, the pain they cause to others, by doing something that leaving the people and the situation behind them just a bit better than what they left it before. It took him 20 years to come up with the term restorative justice, and it was about that time when it was picked up by many other scholars which we know, which we more relate to restorative justice, like Randy Barnett, who said that this is a new paradigm, like Howard Zare, like Neil Christie, like Braithwaite. names that are known to be the fathers of restorative justice. But they, in many ways, took up what Albert Iglash left, and he had his way very much with what Peter said, with processes of self-help, 12 steps, NA, AA, and one of their steps is actually reparation. But working and with people from NA, a lot of debate on forgiveness is involved. And one of the things that Albert Iglash spoke about, that without talking about the victim and the feelings, no healing or rehabilitation process could be proceed or could be effective. And when I mean effective, it's not that obvious today when I say effective that it's not that it doesn't have to do with capital, but I mean there are other virtues that effectiveness can be measured. However, I'm not sure that in science we have the tools to measure them. There are many different ways to define restorative justice. As we are in the context of forgiveness, I would repeat what has already been said. Restorative justice should not be related to forgiveness. Forgiveness is a feeling or a mindset which is developed spontaneously or after a process. It sometimes may arise or may follow restorative justice process. Now, but it's something that it should not be required and should not be guaranteed. And it's important to stress it for any one of you who will practice restorative justice, not to set it as a requirement or an expectation from either side, because it's not just it's obvious that it is the victim that ideally would like to see him or not forgive, but it also the offender and all the other supporters who are involved that are dealing with this process. And it should never be set as a requirement. Now I can start dwelling in deeper into restorative justice, which is a philosophy or idea on how to respond to harmful action by restoring the damages, restoring the harms. It comprises of a complementary or an alternative to the punitive criminal justice systems. These ideas lead to various options, and I will stress voluntary procedures and I'm stressing the voluntary consent, because many restorative justice fall when the consent is not voluntary. And it's aimed in involving the people who are affected, and those who are, the ideologists will say, the more the better. The more we are effective, the better the process is. In a structural mutual dialogue to respond to all the injuries and needs, emotional needs, physical needs, economic needs caused by the harmful action, but also those who led to it. Up till now, I guess that most of you have already heard about it, and it's not new. In the last decades, what was not in the last before 20 years, but in the last decade, it has become a more and more legitimized possibility within the criminal justice system. Restorative justice focuses, as I said, on the harms and the people who are affected. The main actors in restorative justice, of course, are the victims and the offenders, but it's also their supporters, their facilitators, which are have a very important role. Sometimes their role is just to step back and enable the process. Sometimes they have to be a little bit more proactive. the community, which we should never, never forget, the community to which the offender will go back to, and the victim, where they need to justify what they did and why they forgave, if they forgive. If needed, according to the need of the specific process, sometimes also professionals can be involved. And I'm saying also professionals because many restorative justice processes are led by volunteers. So it's not obvious that professional psychologists, criminologists, it can also be lawyers and other criminal justice, police officers that can lead the process, but it's not always so. And in many situations of restorative justice take place, it is actually trained volunteers from the community. The processes, of course, offer the participants an opportunity, each one at its turn, according to a very structured dialogue, to present their thoughts about what happened, their thoughts and feelings, what happened, what did they, everything okay there? The thought of what happened, what do they think that they need to do about it, and what should be done about it, what they feel when it happened. And the emphasis, of course, and I would say it's the important bit of the restorative justice, and we talked before about the education, is learning to talk in a respectful dialogue over how to respond to the needs of other people, to the grievance, how to respond to the loss and the pain that people feel and express. Participants are encouraged to share their thoughts openly. Restorative justice should be created in a very safe setting, and a way to guarantee it is the facilitator's job, is to prepare and in a way build what can be expected and what cannot be expected from restorative justice. And I think it's also every little restorative justice process is like a microcosmos to our society, because we also as a society are very suspicious toward these kind of private justice process. So when it comes to me and an offense which I've been involved, people are very careful, and we need to be very, very attent to these feelings. Different programs aim to different things, and some aim to an outcome agreement, some aim to repair the harms, other just emphasize the dialogue and the face-to-face meetings. In serious crimes, we usually we usually look for the latter. Attentive to a specific need and requirement can produce more restorative outcomes, both for victims and offenders. And in this point, I think it's a lesson for each and every one of us in day-to-day interaction, listening, being attentive to the person sitting in front of you can produce a more just interpersonal relationship, and probably prevent the shame and the resentment which is so evident in crime. I would just want to say that the early writings of restorative justice consider forgiveness as an almost natural outcome, not as a requirement but a natural outcome of a well-facilitated process. However, or even an indication for success. However, today we are much more, due to evidence, we are much more humble with our expectations. And as I said before, it might evolve, it might not. It very much depends on the individual participating in the process. Today we tend to be more vigilant regarding this correlation. Most programs aim to get just some sort of understanding or reconciliation between the victims and offender. There are there's a multitude today flourish of restorative justice programs around the world. These programs can be specified, or to which extent are they really restorative? Are they fully restorative? For example, as we talked before about a restorative prison, or is it possible? Is it really restorative? Is it mostly restorative? Is it partly restorative, or is it pseudo-restorative? And I will talk about some pseudo-restorative programs and what can we learn from it, and it has mostly to do with the aims of the programs. Sometimes they achieve restorative justice or as a byproduct, not as their main interest. Is it direct or indirect? Is it face-to-face meeting, or is it a video conference, or is it just passing letters between the two parties? Is it the specific victims of the specific crime, or is it a surrogate victim? And there are many programs that introduce surrogate victims as part of restorative justice. How well is the facilitator trained? Is he is he trained as a criminologist or psychologist or whatsoever, or is he a member from community who was trained? There are most of the programs actually worldwide use trained community members. Is it a mediation, as a co-mediation? Is it, for example, a lawyer and a social worker working together to coordinate, or is it just a single? And then it's very much the professional education and the professional training which might determine how the process will be, and we see in research that it actually affects the outcomes of the process. Is it managed by a private organization or a non-government organization like an NGO? Or is it a governmental organization, or is it another agent of the criminal justice system which is coordinating the process? Another question is, at what stage of the criminal justice process is the restorative justice process provided or offered? Is it before the trial, before the sentence? Is it after the sentence when the person is sitting for a long term? Is he before release? Is it just before the re-entry to the community? Where is the actual meeting of the restorative justice taking place? Is it in the community center, or is it inside prison? And what are the aims of the different programs? I will specify on the programs which are inside prison. I will give a very short scan as we are almost up with the time. So there's a big debate if restorative justice and imprisonment can go together, because it's two philosophies which are very different in how you address harms. One is you punish and you go, and this probably you already know, you punish and you go forward. The other one is you deal with the core issues that arise from the harmful action. The purists would say that any attempt to put a restorative justice program in jail is wrong and will create just more injustice. These are the purists. However, those who are more pragmatic will say we need to be realistic. we live in a culture where the main way, the main method to deal with damages, with wrongs, with bad behavior is through the prison system. Even though it's a remain from the Middle Ages, still we need to be pragmatic, and processes take change. And we're talking here just about 40 years, 20 years. We've been talking lately with Lisa Rea, who is a big restorative justice person in the US, and she said, I can't wait, this process is too slow. But as a restorative justice person, processes take time. And in the end, they're actually more cost effective than, but this will come to the result. And another thought that if we keep restorative justice out of jail, we are limiting ourselves only to the petty crimes and to the very mild, let's say, offences, even though it's personal, and who am I to say one offence is mild or not. However, if we want to deal with serious violence, we must enter the prison, because this is where we would meet. And what about the victims of serious crime? None of the programs which exist today would recommend or would suggest to influence the criminal justice process by the restorative justice process, because we don't want the motivations of the participants to be distorted. And if offenders know that they might benefit from it, they might go into the process for the wrong reasons, and thus most of the programs today worldwide agree that it should not affect the criminal justice process. There are many restorative justice process or pseudo-restorative justice process which are run by charity or religious or faith-based organizations. One very prominent example is what we call the Sycamore tree program. It's a victim awareness program introducing a surrogate victims in groups of victims and offenders. They create a big circle with victims and offenders. They try that there will be a balanced number, but usually it's more offenders than victims, and the victims tell their story. And I call it pseudo-restorative justice because the main issue is a religious issue. They talk about a story from the Second Testament about when Jesus came to Bethlehem. He met a wealthy person who he was the tax collector of the society, and he climbed on a sycamore tree, and that's why it's called the Sycamore tree. And Jesus told him, how could you do such a thing? Or he had a bit of resentment toward him. And after talking with Jesus, according to the Second Testament, the person repented, and he gave back from the tax to society, and Jesus forgave him, and this is why the program got his name. However, it is more doing with the Christian religion, even though we know that today there's also a Muslim-based Sycamore, a Muslim Sycamore program. But apparently it runs today in more than 30 countries: Australia, Bolivia, Cayman Islands, Cambodia, Costa Rica, England and Wales, the Fiji Island, Germany, Hungary, Italy, Kazakhstan, Kenya, Netherlands, New Zealand, Northern Ireland, Philippines, Rwanda, and there's a long list. But it's very popular, and it runs in many prisons. Another program is the Alternative to Violence. It's also a circle run for prisoners, which is mostly run by volunteers. It originated in the US 1975. And today you can find it in 56 countries, including Israel. According to the homepage of the Alternative to Violence program. It's a pseudo-restorative justice because it leads people to the want to make amends. So it's not strictly restorative, but today more and more is influenced by this philosophy which is becoming more and more popular. Another example is Bridges to Life from Texas in the US, which is also spread over, and also it's a faith-based organization offering healing. I skip forward to programs. There are many victim offenders programs from various sorts which are managed in prison, which are mostly restorative, however being in prisons somehow impede it. There were few efforts to make restorative units in prison or restorative prisons up till today. They didn't work out very well. What we can know, and this is the final, it's difficult to implement restorative justice in prisons. Mostly not because the victims don't want to come into prison, because with a good preparation they overcome the fear. Usually it's administrative programs within the system, within the criminal justice system. Most restorative justice in prison are ad hoc, are action research-based, temporary, and often not integrated into prisons. We need to learn from it. The difficulties are clash between the strict prison routine, schedule, inflexibilities, regulations, security regimens, which make it very difficult for a process which needs a lot of flexibility and attentive to the needs of the individual. Security checks can sometimes lead to the fact that meetings did not start on time. Difficulties in finding time. It's also difficult to find time that match the prison's regime. The administration of meeting put strain on the staff. If the program had no legal statutory base, usually it was prioritized down. And the more time it takes to coordinate, the more costs it creates. However, it was also calculated, but restorative justice in prison do not necessarily cost less. Actually, they might even save costs to society. It is easier to coordinate restorative justice once it comes from in the prison. If the head of the prison is into a restorative mindset and implement restorative justice in prison, it works better. For example, in Belgium, they tried to put restorative justice people or coordinators in different units in prison. It didn't work. It caused a lot of frictions and stress with the staff. If it's from within the prison, it matched more the prison's schedule, and it was more sustainable. It lasted longer, the program, if it was initiated by the prison. Restorative justice in prison does not need necessarily to cost more than provided by the community, even less. Criminal justice professionals conducting restorative justice were found to be more dominant. However, lately in years, they are more aware of that and they know to step back. Programs held in custodial setting are generally easier to find a reparation scheme. Usually they're already embedded, all kind of behavioral correctional programs are already embedded in the institution. Value per money, this is what always interests us. One cannot calculate the value for a victim And the cost, because there are long-term factors, general health issues, as said, from the trauma, long-term costs which cannot be measured. However, it was calculated by Shapland and her research group, the rate of reduced offending due to restorative justice program, and it did so sufficient reduction following restorative justice intervention. However, the finding from different programs not necessarily shows a reduction of recidivism. It shows some reduction in violent behaviors. So we also have to have our expectations better. In the long term, it might also help change the culture, reduce recidivism. Most participants report satisfaction, even if it took place in a prison. The prisoners usually like to go out there because it's a bit of time off the schedule and the regime. The prison staff tend to enjoy the outcomes of the prison and usually last longer if the prison staff benefits. And it eventually reduced the resistance, and it was also found to be healthy to train the prison staff on restorative justice. So restorative unit, and restorative units, as I say, were not very successful, but it's probably an aspiration. If we ask what's in the future, this is the future. To some, as it seems from the data, it was the most affecting holding a restorative justice team, a restorative justice unit in prisons, which was integrated in the prisons and not assigned from the community for tasks from without. And, well, if you're recruiting, I'm your man.